Chapter 1. 6 Years of Silence. For 6 years, silence had been the currency of survival. It lived in the early mornings when the parking lot of Hartwell Industries was still dark, his car one of the first to arrive. It lingered in the fluorescent hum of the finance floor long after most lights had gone out. It followed him home, settling into the corners of his marriage, thick and unspoken, filling every space where conversation used to exist. Hartwell Industries liked to call him a senior financial analyst. The title looked respectable on paper. Inside the building, it was a joke everyone quietly benefited from. He built forecasts the board relied on. He structured financing that kept the company solvent through aggressive expansions. He caught cash flow gaps weeks before they turned into crises. He negotiated with banks, rewrote covenants, corrected disastrous pricing models crafted by reckless sales executives, and quietly absorbed blame when projections didn't match Richard Hartwell's fantasies. It was CFO work. Everyone knew it. No one said it out loud, including him. By year 3, he stopped correcting people when they referred to Richard's numbers, even when those numbers were his. By year 4, he stopped submitting expense reports for late-night meals. By year 5, he stopped counting weekends. 60 hours a week became the baseline. 70 during busy seasons, which somehow never ended. He answered emails during anniversaries, reviewed spreadsheets during funerals, took conference calls from hospital waiting rooms when Richard demanded updates. Loyalty, Richard called it. Opportunity, Vanessa echoed. Sacrifice, he learned to name only in his own head. Richard Hartwell ruled Hartwell Industries the same way he ruled his family, through pressure, proximity, and constant evaluation. The man never raised his voice in meetings. He didn't need to. His disappointment was quieter and more lethal. Richard would walk past desks, stop just long enough to glance at a monitor, then keep moving. No comment, no praise, just the implication that something, somewhere, was always insufficient. When he did speak to him directly, it was rarely about performance. "You're lucky," Richard once said, leaning back in his leather chair, hands folded over his stomach. Most people would kill to be this close to the engine. Close to the engine meant heat without control. Vanessa used to defend him. Early on, she'd bring him coffee late at night when he worked from home, curl up beside him on the couch, ask questions about his day. She told friends he was brilliant. She told her father he was indispensable. That version of Vanessa faded slowly, not in an argument or betrayal, but in a gradual reallocation of loyalty. By the second year, her questions became shorter. By the fourth, she stopped waiting up. By the sixth, conversations were transactional. "Dad says the board is nervous. Dad thinks you should push harder on the banks. Dad doesn't like surprises." Sometimes, lying in bed beside her, he wondered when she'd started saying Dad instead of Richard, and when she'd stopped saying we all together. Dinner conversations revolved around the company. Vacations were postponed indefinitely. Holidays became appearances. Every decision filtered through Hartwell logic. Optics, leverage, positioning. Even their marriage felt like an extension of the balance sheet. He told himself it was temporary, that proving himself would eventually lead to recognition. That patience was strategy. That silence was strength. On Fridays, when younger analysts packed up early, he stayed behind to clean things up. On Saturdays, he logged in just to check numbers. On Sundays, he revised forecasts no one had officially requested, because experience had taught him they would be demanded Monday morning, urgently, angrily, without acknowledgement. Once, a junior analyst asked him why he never took time off. He smiled without humor. Someone has to keep the wheels on. The truth was uglier. He didn't know how to stop. Burnout crept in quietly, not as exhaustion, but as numbness. He stopped feeling proud when models worked. Stopped feeling angry when Richard dismissed his warnings. Stopped feeling much of anything beyond a low, constant tension, like a muscle permanently clenched. At night, he lay awake running scenarios in his head. Best case. Worst case. What if? Contingency upon contingency. He could predict Hartwell Industries' future with brutal accuracy, except his own place in it. Because despite everything he did, he remained unofficial, replaceable, disposable. Richard made sure of that. During one quarterly review, after a grueling presentation he'd built himself, Richard nodded once and said, "Not bad. But remember, no one's irreplaceable." The board chuckled. Vanessa didn't look at him. He told himself that loyalty meant endurance, that being useful was the same as being valued, that if he just kept absorbing pressure, eventually the weight would lessen. It never did. Instead, silence thickened. He stopped pushing back, stopped asking for clarity, stopped correcting altered reports that softened risk language before board meetings. He documented everything privately, a habit born not of rebellion, but instinct. Something in him understood danger before he consciously acknowledged it. By the time the 6th year ended, his life had narrowed to two axes: work and obligation. Joy existed only as memory. Rest felt undeserved. Approval felt conditional. When he finally submitted a formal vacation request, 2 weeks, properly scheduled, properly approved, it felt almost transgressive. Richard approved it without comment. Vanessa reacted with irritation disguised as support. "Just don't unplug completely," she said. "Dad might need you." He nodded. Of course he would. But something inside him, quiet, exhausted, long suppressed, registered the approval differently. Not as permission, as distance. And for the first time in 6 years, silence didn't feel like surrender. It felt like something waiting to break. Chapter 2, Permission to Breathe. The approval came without ceremony. An email. 2 lines. No greeting. Vacation request approved. Insure coverage. R.H. He stared at the screen longer than necessary, rereading the words as if they might rearrange themselves into something warmer. They didn't. There was no acknowledgement of the 6 years without a real break, no recognition of what it had taken to finally ask. Just permission, conditional, procedural, easily revocable. He forwarded the email to HR, copied Vanessa, and closed his laptop. For a moment, he sat there in the quiet of his office, hands folded, heart doing nothing remarkable. No surge of relief, no excitement, just a strange hollowness, as if his body hadn't yet been informed that it was allowed to stop. That evening, he mentioned Paris over dinner. Vanessa paused mid-bite, fork hovering. 2 weeks. "Yes," he said. "That's what we discussed." She exhaled through her nose. Not a sigh, an evaluation. "Dad's not thrilled. He approved it." "Approval doesn't mean he's happy," she replied, already defensive, already aligned. "You know how things are right now." He nodded. He always nodded. "I'll be reachable." Her shoulders relaxed slightly. "Good. I just don't want this to turn into a problem." The word this hung between them, vague and accusatory. Not the workload, not the company, not the years of strain. The vacation. Packing felt unnatural. He folded shirts he rarely wore, checked lists twice, slipped his laptop in his bag out of habit, then paused, removed it, put it back in the drawer. His phone buzzed constantly, as if sensing abandonment. Emails arriving faster than usual, last-minute urgent, requests materializing out of nowhere. Richard stopped him in the hallway the day before he left. "Don't make this a habit," Richard said lightly, hand on his shoulder in a gesture that felt more like a clamp. "We all make sacrifices." "I've arranged coverage," he replied. "Everything's documented." Richard smiled without warmth. "Good. Because if something breaks, I'll expect you to fix it. Not we. You." At home, Vanessa watched him pack from the doorway, arms crossed. "You're really going through with this?" "Yes." She hesitated, then said, "Just don't get ideas." "Ideas. About changing things." People come back from trips thinking they've had revelations. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "This is just a vacation." He looked at her, truly looked, and realized how carefully everything between them had been defined lately. Boundaries drawn not for intimacy, but containment. "Of course," he said. The flight to Paris was long and uncomfortable, not because of turbulence or cramped seating, but because stillness made him restless. Every few minutes, he reached for his phone, thumb hovering over the screen, waiting for something, an alert, a demand, a crisis. None came. At 30,000 feet, with the cabin lights dimmed and strangers asleep around him, he felt exposed. Without urgency, Without tasks, there was nothing to focus on except the dull ache in his chest and the fatigue he'd been postponing for years. When the plane touched down, Paris greeted him with indifference. Rain slicked the runway. The terminal buzzed with languages he didn't understand, announcements he didn't need to follow. For once, no one needed anything from him. The hotel room overlooked the river. He stood by the window, coat still on, watching boats drift past, their lights smeared across the water like soft mistakes. It was beautiful, objectively. He felt nothing. That night, he ordered room service and ate mechanically, checking his phone between bites. Vanessa had texted once. "Let me know you landed." Richard hadn't said a word. The silence felt provisional, like a hell breath. The next morning, he woke early out of habit, heart racing as if he were late. There was nowhere to be, no meeting to prepare for, no numbers to review. He showered, dressed, and sat on the edge of the bed, unsure what came next. Outside, the city moved at its own pace. People lingered at cafes, laughed, argued, took their time. The concept irritated him before it intrigued him. How could they afford such inefficiency? He walked anyway. Along the Seine, he watched couples argue over maps. Street musicians tune instruments without urgency. Vendors arrange postcards that no one immediately bought. Time behaved differently here. It didn't demand. It offered. He ordered coffee at a small cafe and froze when the barista asked if he wanted to sit or take it to go. No one had asked him a choice like that in years. "Sit," he said finally. He sat for nearly an hour, coffee growing cold, mind racing. Every few minutes, he checked his phone, then forced himself to put it face down. His leg bounced under the table. Rest felt like dereliction. That afternoon, he wandered without direction, steps slowing only because his body insisted. Fatigue caught up with him in waves, deep, bone-level exhaustion that sleep alone couldn't touch. He realized he didn't remember the last time he'd been alone without being on call. Back in the hotel room, he lay on the bed staring at the ceiling, listening to unfamiliar sounds through the open window. A siren, laughter, music drifting up from the street. His phone remained silent. For the first time, he wondered what would happen if he stopped anticipating disaster. Paris, he understood dimly, wasn't here to make him happy. It wasn't a reward. It was space, distance, a pause button he'd never allowed himself to press. He stood again at the window as evening settled over the river, lights blooming along the banks. He felt numb, hollowed out by years of vigilance, unsure how to exist without it. And as the city breathed around him, he realized he didn't yet know how to breathe back. Chapter 3, The Call That Snapped the Chain. The wine arrived, already poured. He hadn't ordered it himself. The waiter had recommended it. Something local, something calm, and he hadn't argued. He sat at a small iron table near the edge of the Seine, the river sliding past with lazy confidence, reflecting the amber glow of street lamps and passing boats. Evening in Paris moved without urgency, unconcerned with deadlines or quarterly projections. He held the glass by the stem, turning it slightly, watching the liquid catch the light. For once, he wasn't checking his phone every minute. It lay face down on the table, silent, inert. He took a sip. It tasted fuller than he expected, warmer. For a fleeting moment, he wondered if this was what people meant when they talked about enjoying themselves. The phone vibrated. Not a gentle buzz. A sharp, insistent rattle against metal, loud enough to draw a glance from the couple at the next table. He didn't touch it immediately. He stared at the screen as it lit up, the name unmistakable. Richard Hartwell. His chest tightened, not with fear exactly, but reflex. 6 years of conditioning surged forward all at once. Whatever piece he'd borrowed from the evening evaporated. He flipped the phone over and answered. "What do you think you're doing?" Richard's voice exploded through the speaker, loud enough that he instinctively pulled the phone away from his ear. "Do you have any idea what's happening back here?" "I'm on approved leave," he said evenly, keeping his voice low. "Everything's covered." "Covered?" Richard barked a laugh, sharp and cruel. "You think sending a few emails counts as coverage? I had the board asking where you were this morning. I sent the documentation you asked for. The models are, don't talk to me like I don't understand my own company," Richard snapped. You don't disappear when things are fragile. You don't run off to Europe like some entitled tourist. A pause. Heavy. Deliberate. You've gotten lazy. The word landed cleanly, without hesitation. He felt it then, not anger, not yet, but something loosening like a knot pulled too tight for too long finally giving way. I followed procedure, he said. HR approved it. You approved it. That was a courtesy, Richard said. Not permission to abandon your responsibilities. Abandon. As if 6 years of weekends and midnight calls had been a warm-up. People at nearby tables had started to notice. The couple beside him pretended not to listen. A man across the way openly glanced over, curiosity flickering across his face. "Lower your voice," he said quietly. Richard scoffed. "Or what? You'll what, hang up?" Another pause. This one crackled. "You've forgotten your place," Richard continued. "You're not family first. You're staff. And staff doesn't take vacations when the company needs them." Something inside him shifted. He thought of the forecasts rewritten to soften risk. The nights spent correcting other people's mistakes. Vanessa's voice echoing her father's concerns instead of his own. The years of swallowing frustration and calling it loyalty. "I didn't forget my place," he said. "I learned it." Richard didn't hear him, or didn't care. "I'm done carrying you," Richard went on, momentum building. "If this is how you want to behave, then we don't need you. I don't need a lazy pig bleeding my company while he drinks wine in Paris." There it was. Public. Ugly. Unfiltered. Something broke. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't hurt. It felt like pressure releasing from a sealed container. A quiet hiss followed by sudden, startling clarity. He laughed. Not a chuckle. Not amusement. A real laugh. Short, sharp, uncontrollable. The sound surprised him as much as anyone. Heads turned. The couple beside him froze. Across the table, the curious man raised an eyebrow. "What's so funny?" Richard demanded. He held the phone away from his ear and looked at it, still laughing softly, shoulders shaking once before settling. The laughter wasn't joy. It was relief. A body finally realizing it no longer needed a brace. "You're firing me," he said, not as a question. "Yes," Richard snapped instantly, eager now, righteous. "Effective immediately. We don't need you. We'll survive just fine without dead weight." There was no discussion, no HR, no formality, just a tantrum delivered across an ocean. He felt oddly calm. "All right," he said. Richard paused. "That's it. Yes. You think you could just walk away?" Richard said. "You think there won't be consequences?" He glanced around. The river kept moving. The lights kept flickering. Paris didn't care. "I think," he said, "that you've made your position very clear. Don't you dare take that tone with me," Richard hissed. "You owe everything you have to this family." He looked at the glass of wine in his hand, thought about how many nights he'd missed, how much he'd given. "No," he said softly, "I really don't." Richard was still talking, threats, accusations, words stacking on top of each other, frantic now, uncontained. He didn't wait for the sentence to end. He ended the call. The line went dead with a soft click. For a moment, he just sat there, phone resting on the table, the world strangely quiet. The river flowed. Glass clinked somewhere behind him. A boat horn sounded in the distance. Across from him, the man who'd been watching leaned back slightly, studying him with open interest. He lifted his glass. His hand was steady. He took a long drink, feeling the wine settle warm in his chest, and exhale for what felt like the first time in years. Something fundamental had snapped free, and it did not come back. Chapter 4. A stranger at the next table. The silence after the call lingered longer than expected. He sat with his glass half finished, phone resting beside it like a discarded tool, pulse steady but unfamiliar in its calm. The night continued uninterrupted around him. Waiters moved between tables. Laughter rose and fell. The river kept sliding past, as if nothing consequential had happened at all. Rough conversation. The voice came from his right. He turned his head slightly. The man at the neighboring table had shifted in his chair, one arm draped casually over the back, a faint, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Mid-50s, maybe, well-dressed without being loud about it. The kind of presence that didn't compete for attention, but somehow always had it. Sorry, the man added, gesturing vaguely between them. Hard not to overhear. He considered brushing it off. 6 years of conditioning told him to keep things contained, private, controlled. But the chain was already broken. Whatever had snapped during that phone call hadn't been repaired by silence. It happens, he said. Or it didn't. I'm not entirely sure yet. The man chuckled softly. From the sound of it, something definitely happened. A waiter approached, refilling the man's glass without asking. The label on the bottle caught his eye. Expensive. Intentional. I'm James, the man said, extending a hand across the small gap between tables. James Morrison. He shook it absently, still half in his own head. Good to meet you. Mind if I sit? James asked. Or would you prefer solitude after that? He glanced at the empty chair across from him, then at the river. For once, he didn't feel the need to retreat. Go ahead. James moved his glass and chair easily, settling in with practiced comfort. That wasn't just a bad boss, he said, not unkindly. That was a man used to obedience. He smiled thinly. You could say that. James took a sip. Let me guess. Family business. He hesitated, then nodded. My father-in-law. James winced. The worst kind. Something loosened in his chest at that. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition. 6 years, he said before he could stop himself. I worked there 6 years. And tonight, James prompted. Tonight, I was fired for taking a vacation. James raised an eyebrow. Impressive timing. It was approved, he added reflexively, as if still defending himself. Then he stopped. There was no tribunal here. No consequences for honesty. I did everything by the book. James studied him more closely now. You don't strike me as someone who needs to justify himself. I wasn't, he said. Until I was. They sat quietly for a moment. The city hummed around them, distant and forgiving. So what did you do for them? James asked. Officially, he gave a faint smile. Senior financial analyst. James laughed outright. And unofficially, he rolled the stem of his glass between his fingers. The words came easier than expected. Everything that kept them from collapsing. James didn't interrupt. I built the forecasts, managed bank relationships, cleaned up bad deals, flagged risks that no one wanted to hear about, fixed pricing errors after sales promised margins that didn't exist. He paused, then added, I did the work so Richard could look decisive. James's expression sharpened. Not skepticism, but interest. Sounds like CFO work. It was without the title, without the authority, he corrected. Without the protection. James nodded slowly. That's a dangerous position. He laughed quietly. Apparently. James leaned back, glancing toward the river before looking at him again. You mentioned a deal earlier. Something about bleeding the company. He stiffened slightly. Old instincts flared. Confidentiality, caution, silence. But something about James's demeanor felt different. Not predatory. Not probing. Just attentive. The bourbon contract, he said carefully. James's glass paused midway to his lips. Bergman Industrial Logistics? Yes. James set the glass down. Hartwell has that. Unfortunately, he said. 3 years now. James whistled softly. That's a brutal account. It shouldn't exist, he said, the words tumbling out now. Margins were underbid to win it. Volume assumptions were fantasy. They locked themselves into penalties they can't absorb. James's eyes stayed on him, unblinking. I warned them, he continued. Repeatedly. The contract looked strong on the surface, but it's margin negative once you factor in compliance costs and fuel volatility. Every quarter they hide it deeper. James leaned forward slightly. Hide it how? He hesitated only a fraction of a second. Reclassification. Deferred losses. Adjusted risk language. They move numbers just enough to keep lenders calm. James exhaled slowly. That's bold. Reckless, he said, and unsustainable. James tapped the table once, thoughtfully. Apex lost that bid by a hair. He looked up sharply. Richard celebrated for weeks, James went on. Said he crushed us. He did, he said. Short term. And long term, he met James's gaze. It's a slow bleed. James smiled then, not triumphantly, but with something like respect. You know, he said, Most people don't see the difference. I try to make them see it. James tilted his head. And what happened to your reports? They were softened. James laughed quietly. Of course they were. The two men sat there, strangers no longer, sharing the strange intimacy of professionals who spoke the same language. For the first time in years, he wasn't explaining himself to be validated. He was being understood. You didn't sound bitter on that call, James said after a moment. You sounded relieved. He considered that. I was. James raised his glass. To relief, then. He lifted his own in response. The clink was soft, almost ceremonial. Across the river, lights shimmered. Between them, something unspoken but solid took shape. Not an alliance, not yet, but recognition. Unexpected, earned, and quietly powerful. Chapter 5, An Offer Without Chains. They stayed at the table long after the wine should have been finished. The river darkened as night deepened, reflections stretching and breaking as boats passed. A second bottle appeared without either of them asking. Conversation slowed, not from awkwardness, but from the rare comfort of not having to rush. James leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled loosely, studying him with an expression that wasn't evaluative so much as precise. You know, James said, most people in your position would already be asking what comes next. He shrugged lightly. For 6 years, next was just another problem. James smiled at that. Fair enough. A pause followed. James glanced toward the river again, then back. I'm not in the habit of recruiting people at cafes. I wouldn't expect you to be, but I also don't ignore clarity when it drops into my lap. James's voice remained even. What you described tonight, your understanding of Hartwell's internal mechanics, that's not something you learn from the outside. He said nothing, letting the words settle. I need someone like that, James continued. Someone who knows how pressure actually moves through an organization. Not theory, reality. The implication hung there, waiting. James reached into his jacket and withdrew a simple card, placing it between them. No logo flourishes, just a name and number. CFO. James said plainly. Apex Manufacturing Division. Full authority over finance, pricing, and risk. Direct line to me. No family interference. No cosmetic titles. He stared at the card, pulse steady. And the chains? He asked. James chuckled. That's the best part. There aren't any. He raised an eyebrow. Competitive compensation, James said. Market plus, not family discount. Defined hours. Mandatory vacation. If I call you after midnight, it better be because the building is on fire. He laughed despite himself. James's expression sobered. And if you tell me something's wrong, I don't edit it to make myself feel better. The contrast was dizzying. This isn't a trap? He asked. James met his gaze evenly. If it were, I'd be selling you urgency. He gestured to the card. No deadline. No pressure. You take your time. Finish your trip. Think. He felt something unfamiliar press against his ribs. Not excitement. Not fear. Possibility. I won't say yes tonight, he said. I'd be disappointed if you did. James replied easily. People who jump without thinking usually regret it. They stood shortly after. James shook his hand again, firmer this time. Enjoy Paris, James said. It's good for perspective. He watched James disappear into the crowd before sitting back down, card still on the table. His phone vibrated. Then again. And again. Vanessa. Missed call. Missed call. Text. What happened? Dad is furious. Another vibration. You can't do this. Call me. He let the phone buzz itself quiet. The walk back to the hotel felt different. Lighter somehow. The city seemed less like scenery and more like a place where things happened without permission. He stopped at a bakery, still open late. Bought something he couldn't pronounce. Ate it standing on the sidewalk, crumbs on his coat. No one corrected him. No one cared. Back in the room, he sat on the edge of the bed, card in one hand, phone in the other. Vanessa called again. He answered this time. Where are you? She demanded immediately. Do you have any idea what you've done? I'm in Paris, he said calmly. On vacation. This isn't funny, she snapped. Dad fired you in a fit of anger. You need to fix this. I don't, he said. Silence. What do you mean you don't? She asked. I mean, I'm not coming home early. I'm not calling him. And I'm not apologizing for taking approved leave. Her breath came sharp through the phone. You're being selfish. He almost laughed, not bitterly, just softly. I've been many things. Selfish isn't one of them. You're throwing everything away, she said. Our life. Your career. Our life, he repeated. Or his. Don't do this, she said, voice tight now. We can smooth this over. No, he replied gently. You can. Another pause. Longer this time. When did you become like this? She asked. He looked around the room, the open window, the city sounds drifting in, the absence of obligation pressing in on him. I think, he said, this is who I am when I'm allowed to stop pretending. Her response came sharp and wounded. You're abandoning us. He closed his eyes. I'm staying. For what? She demanded. For myself. She hung up. He placed the phone on the nightstand, face down. It buzzed again almost immediately. He didn't look. Instead, he picked up the card once more, then set it carefully into his wallet, not as a commitment, but as a reminder. He moved to the window, watching Paris stretch out below him, unbothered by corporate crises or family expectations. Boats glided past. Somewhere, someone laughed too loudly. He reached for the phone again, thumb hovering. Then, deliberately, he powered it off. The room fell quiet, not empty, but full. Full of space. Full of time. Full of something he'd forgotten how to claim. He turned back toward the bed, toward the city, toward the days ahead that belonged to no one else. And for the first time in 6 years, he chose to finish what he'd started. The vacation. Fully. On his terms. Reclaiming time. Chapter 6, Numbers That Don't Lie. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane leveled out over the Atlantic. He loosened his seatbelt slightly, more from habit than comfort, and stared at the seatback screen without really seeing it. Around him, passengers settled into the peculiar stillness of long-haul travel. Blankets unfolded, headphones adjusted, lives temporarily suspended between departure and return. For him, the silence felt heavier. Halfway through the flight, his phone vibrated once in his jacket pocket. He hesitated before pulling it out. He turned it back on only after leaving Paris, a controlled compromise. 1 foot still in the quiet, 1 foot back in reality. A message from James. If you're awake, take a look at what I'm sending. No rush. An attachment followed. Encrypted. Professional. He waited until the plane reached cruising altitude before opening it. The document loaded slowly, line by line, revealing a clean, meticulously organized industry analysis. Apex letterhead. Neutral language. No drama. Just data. He felt his posture change instantly, shoulders tightening, mind snapping into a familiar configuration. This, numbers, structure, patterns, was where he lived best. He scrolled. Market comparisons. Margin trends. Contract exposure across competitors. Then Hartwell Industries. He frowned. The surface metrics looked fine. Too fine. Revenue growth within expectations. Debt ratios stable. EBITDA holding just above warning thresholds. On paper, Richard's company was disciplined. But discipline had a texture, and this felt smooth in the wrong places. He tapped into the appendix, heart rate quickening slightly. There it was. Contract-level breakdowns. Bergman Industrial Logistics. His jaw tightened. The numbers Apex had projected for Bergman were brutally honest. Thin margins, extreme sensitivity to fuel costs, punitive penalty clauses highlighted in red. He recognized the structure instantly. James hadn't exaggerated. Hartwell's reported margins didn't align. They couldn't. He closed his eyes briefly, reconstructing internal spreadsheets from memory. He could see the adjustments Richard had demanded. The temporary deferrals. The reclassifications that shifted losses into future quarters that never seemed to arrive. He scrolled again. Apex's analysis showed cumulative exposure over 3 years. The total loss was staggering. Hartwell hadn't just underbid. They were bleeding. Slowly. Quietly. Intentionally obscured. He exhaled through his nose and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. That's why he panicked, he thought. Richard hadn't called because of abandonment. He'd called because control had slipped, because the one person who actually understood the scaffolding holding the illusion upright was suddenly unreachable. He kept reading. Other contracts surfaced, smaller, less visible, but patterned the same way. Aggressive pricing, overextended commitments. Risk language softened beyond recognition. He remembered board meetings where he'd presented conservative forecasts, only to see them reappear days later altered just enough to soothe nerves. He remembered asking questions that were answered with irritation instead of clarity. You worry too much. That's not how we present things. Let's not alarm people. His fingers tightened around the phone. Then he reached a section he hadn't expected. Keyman risk exposure. He blinked once. Read it again. Hartwell Industries had quietly increased its Keyman life insurance policies over the last 18 months. Not just on Richard, but on senior operational roles, including his. His stomach dropped. The policy value listed beside his role made his throat go dry. $15 million. He stared at the number, pulse thudding in his ears, the muted roar of the engines suddenly louder. He knew this hadn't been in the original structure. He'd reviewed those policies years ago, signed off on coverage appropriate for optics and lender reassurance. Nothing excessive. This was different. He scrolled further, eyes scanning clauses with growing unease. Change of control accelerators. Assignment riders. Conditions tied to unexpected loss of executive function. The language was clinical, detached, legal, but the implication pressed down on him with cold weight. He thought of the hours he'd worked, the stress he'd normalized, the chest tightness he'd ignored, the doctor's appointment he'd postponed twice because Richard needed numbers by morning. He thought of the way Richard dismissed exhaustion as weakness, the way he'd once joked about stress being cheaper than talent. A memory surfaced unbidden. A meeting late evening. Just the two of them. Richard leaning back, swirling a drink. You're important to the company, he'd said casually. You should make sure you're taking care of yourself. At the time, it had sounded like concern. Now, reading the policy language, it sounded like inventory management. He locked the phone and stared straight ahead, heart pounding but mind strangely clear. This wasn't paranoia. The numbers didn't dramatize. They didn't accuse. They simply aligned. Financial manipulation to hide losses. Contracts structured for appearance, not sustainability. Risk pushed downward and inward. And a financial incentive attached to his role that made his burnout profitable. Loyalty hadn't just been exploited. It had been leveraged. He opened the document once more, forcing himself to read every line carefully, methodically, like he'd trained himself to do in crisis. No emotion, just verification. Everything matched. Everything. When he finally powered the screen off, his reflection stared back at him from the dark glass, older than he remembered, thinner around the eyes. The plane hummed steadily through the night, indifferent. He sat there for a long time, hands folded, breathing slow and controlled. For 6 years, he believed endurance was noble. Now he understood something far more precise. Staying hadn't been loyalty. It had been exposure. And if he hadn't left when he did, the numbers suggested he might not have left at all. Chapter 7. Welcome home to an ambush. The house felt wrong the moment he stepped inside. Not unfamiliar, just staged. The lights were on in every room, brighter than necessary, as if clarity could be forced through wattage. His suitcase rolled softly over the hardwood floor, the sound swallowed by an unnatural stillness. No television, no music, no greeting. Voices drifted from the dining room. Measured, controlled, professional. He stopped in the doorway. Vanessa sat at the head of the table, posture perfect, hands folded as if this were a meeting she intended to chair. To her right sat Richard Hartwell, immaculate as ever, jacket buttoned, expression carved from practiced authority. To her left, 2 men in dark suits leafed through folders, pins aligned with military precision. Another woman, early 40s, sharp-eyed, sat slightly apart, tablet balanced on her knee. Lawyers. Richard looked up first. His smile didn't reach his eyes. There you are, he said, as if greeting a tardy employee. Sit down. He didn't. Instead, he set his suitcase upright by the wall and remained standing, one hand resting lightly on the handle. Vanessa's eyes flicked to it, then back to his face. No warmth, No relief. Only calculation. You should have called, she said. We've been waiting. For what? He asked calmly. Richard gestured to the table. To resolve this. One of the lawyers slid a thick stack of documents forward, stopping precisely at the edge of the table. Tabs bristled from the side like warning flags. Termination agreement. Non-disclosure. Non-compete. Severance. Divorce filing. He recognized the order instantly. This was prepared quickly, he said. Richard's smile thinned. We're efficient. Vanessa leaned forward slightly. This doesn't have to be ugly. He almost laughed. Funny, he said, because this looks like an ambush. Her jaw tightened. You embarrass my father. Richard cut in smoothly. You embarrassed yourself. Walking out. Hanging up on me. Leaving the company exposed. I was already fired, he replied. Publicly. Over the phone. The woman with the tablet finally spoke. We could debate tone later. Right now, we need signatures. One of the lawyers pushed a pen toward him. Let's start with the severance, Richard said. It's generous, considering circumstances. He picked up the document and skimmed it. Not because he needed to, but because it amused him now to see how small they'd made it. $50,000. 6 years. CFO-level work. Endless weekends. Crisis management that kept lenders calm and doors open. He looked up slowly. This is a joke. Richard's expression hardened. Watch yourself. No, he said. You should. Vanessa crossed her arms. You abandoned the company during a critical period. That limits your leverage. I took approved leave. You left anyway, she said sharply. And then you refused to come home. He met her eyes. I refused to be bullied. Richard slapped his hand lightly against the table. Not loud, but decisive. Enough. Sign the papers. Take the money. Walk away quietly. That's the offer. And if I don't? Richard leaned back, folding his arms. Then we make things difficult. The word we landed deliberately. The lawyer cleared his throat. The non-compete is broad, he said, tone neutral. 5 years. Global. He raised an eyebrow. That's unenforceable. Richard smiled. You'd be surprised what's enforceable when you can't afford the fight. Vanessa's voice cut in, cool and rehearsed. This is what happens when you choose ego over family. He turned to her fully now. Is that what you think this is? She didn't hesitate. You were useful. You stopped being useful. The words didn't sting. They clarified. So this, he said, gesturing around the room, is about control. It's about containment, Richard corrected. You know too much. Silence followed that admission. One of the lawyers shifted uncomfortably. He placed the documents back on the table, aligning them carefully. I'm not signing anything today. Richard's smile vanished. That wasn't a request. It wasn't an obligation either. Vanessa stood abruptly. You can't just walk out. This affects me. I'm aware, he said. You made sure of that. Richard rose as well, looming now, voice low. You think you're untouchable? No, he replied evenly. I think you're overreaching. Richard scoffed. You have nothing. He met his father-in-law's gaze, unflinching. You fired me without cause. On approved leave. In front of witnesses. The lawyers froze. Richard's eyes flicked briefly toward them, then back. Careful. I am, he said. That's why I'm not signing. The woman with the tablet finally spoke again. We strongly advise you to reconsider. I strongly advise you to stop pretending this is clean. Vanessa's voice trembled, not with sadness, but fury. You're destroying everything. He picked up his suitcase handle. No, he said quietly. I'm leaving. Richard stepped forward. If you walk out that door without signing, you'll regret it. He paused at the threshold, turned back once. For 6 years, he said, I thought silence was loyalty. Today, it's just clarity. No one stopped him. The door closed behind him with a soft, final click. Outside, the air was cold and honest. His breath fogged briefly before vanishing. The house loomed behind him, bright, controlled, sealed tight with its secrets. He stood there alone on the driveway, suitcase beside him, heart steady, mind clear. And for the first time since coming home, he knew exactly where he stood. Chapter 8, The Calm Counterstrike. The hotel room smelled faintly of detergent and anonymity. He sat on the edge of the bed, suitcase still unopened, coat draped over a chair he hadn't chosen. phone resting in his palm like a loaded instrument. Outside, traffic moved with indifferent rhythm. Connecticut had welcomed him back with fluorescent lighting and legal threats, and he'd chosen, deliberately, not to return home. He didn't feel angry. That surprised him most. He felt precise. James answered on the second ring. "I was hoping you'd call," James said, voice steady, unsurprised. "I'm in," he replied. No preamble, no hesitation. "If the offer still stands." There was a pause, brief, respectful. "It does," James said. "Nothing's changed." "Then I accept." James exhaled softly. "Good. We'll do this properly. No rush. No spectacle. That's what I want," he said. "Clean. Controlled." "You'll have it," James replied. "Take tonight. Tomorrow, I'll connect you with our general counsel. Not to represent you, but to coordinate. You need your own." "I already know," he said. James chuckled once. "I suspected you would." When the call ended, he sat there a moment longer, letting the reality settle, not with excitement, but with relief. The decision hadn't felt like a leap. It felt like alignment. He searched for employment attorneys the same way he did everything else. Methodically, credentials over charisma, experience over promises. He booked a consultation for the next morning with a woman whose biography emphasized litigation, not negotiation. Her office was spare, efficient, no art pretending at warmth. She read in silence while he spoke. He explained the firing, the approved leave, the ambush, the severance, the non-compete. The divorce papers served as leverage. When he finished, she leaned back slightly and removed her glasses. "They made several mistakes," she said. That was the first time anyone had said it so plainly. "Which ones matter most?" he asked. "The order," she replied. "They fired you impulsively, without cause, while you were on documented, approved leave. Then they attempted to coerce silence through overbroad restrictions and bundled it with a divorce filing." She smiled thinly. "Judges hate that." He nodded once. "The non-compete? Likely unenforceable," she said. "Retaliatory termination invalidates much of it, especially at that scope. And the severance? Insulting," she said bluntly, "but useful." "Useful how?" "It shows bad faith," she replied. "They're trying to buy erasure, not compensate service." He felt something ease in his chest. "What do you recommend?" he asked. She folded her hands. "You don't refuse outright. You let them believe they still have leverage. You sign, eventually, but not before they expose themselves further." He tilted his head. Meaning we let them overreach," she said. "Every threat, every demand, every attempt at intimidation strengthens your position." "And the divorce?" She paused. "No children. No shared operating assets beyond the home." "No," he said. "Then it's procedural," she said. "Emotionally difficult. Legally simple." He considered that. Vanessa's words replayed in his mind. "You were useful." He felt no urge to defend himself anymore. "Good," he said. She slid a folder across the desk. "We'll proceed calmly. No grand gestures. No confrontation unless necessary." He almost smiled. That seems to be a theme lately. When he left her office, the air felt lighter, not because the situation had improved, but because it was finally intelligible. He understood the board now, the rules, the timing. Power, he realized, wasn't loud. It was patient. Vanessa called that evening. He answered, not because he hoped for reconciliation, but because avoidance no longer served him. "You hired a lawyer," she said. No greeting. "Yes." "You're escalating this." "No," he replied evenly. "I'm responding." She laughed sharply. "You think you're winning?" "I'm not competing," he said. "I'm concluding." There was a pause. "Dad says you're making a mistake." "I believe him," he said. "He's very good at that." Her voice softened just slightly. "We could still fix this." He closed his eyes briefly. "Vanessa, listen to me. Carefully. I'm not trying to punish anyone. I'm not angry. I'm done." "You're throwing away 6 years," she said. "No," he replied. "I'm reclaiming what's left." She didn't respond immediately. When she did, her tone had cooled again. "Then let's make the divorce clean. That's my intention." Another pause. This one longer. "When did you stop needing us?" she asked quietly. He looked out the window, watching headlights blur past. "When I realized needing you was the problem." The call ended without ceremony. Over the next days, he moved deliberately. He forwarded documentation to his lawyer, archived emails, approval records, timestamp files. He didn't dramatize. He didn't editorialize. He simply organized truth. James checked in once, not to pressure, but to reassure. "Take the time you need," James said. "We're not going anywhere." "I know," he replied. That mattered. Each step he took now was chosen. Not reactive, not defensive. Chosen. He slept better, ate regularly, took walks without checking his phone. The constant vigilance that had once defined him loosened its grip, replaced by something steadier. Intent. Hartwell Industries could posture. Richard could threaten. Vanessa could reduce their marriage to utility. None of it moved him anymore, because for the first time, every move ahead of him belonged to no one else. Chapter 9. The last time he walks in. The Hartwell headquarters loomed larger than he remembered, polished marble floors reflecting fluorescent lights that felt harsher than home. He paused just inside the revolving doors, suitcase in hand, jacket draped over one arm. The lobby was quiet but not empty. Receptionists glanced up briefly, their expressions polite but strained. Rumors of corporate turmoil had a way of making even the mundane feel charged. He didn't rush. This was deliberate. A secretary led him to the executive suite, doors opening onto a space both familiar and sterile. Richard sat behind the massive mahogany desk, fingers steepled, eyes cold. Vanessa was perched in a chair beside him, arms crossed, her expression unreadable but taut. Two lawyers waited patiently at a side table, their notepads open, pens poised. Richard looked up sharply. "You're punctual." "Yes," he said evenly. "I like to know exactly when I face consequences." Vanessa's lips tightened. "You're confident," she said. "I prefer accurate," he corrected, placing his suitcase carefully against the wall. He didn't sit. Not yet. Standing kept him in control. Richard leaned back in his chair. "So what now? You return, grovel, sign, and pretend nothing happened?" He allowed a faint smile. "Not quite." Richard's brow furrowed. "Oh." He pulled the letter from his wallet, the Apex CFO offer, dated, signed provisionally by James Morrison. He laid it flat on the desk, so the edges aligned perfectly. "I'm joining Apex as CFO," he said clearly, voice calm. Effective immediately. James witnessed everything, the approval, the firing, the timeline. "And I have documentation." The lawyers exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible glance. It was the one they'd been waiting for. Proof of procedure, evidence of misstep. Their pens hovered above the page, reassessing risk. Hartwell's posture had been everything until now. Commanding, certain, untouchable. That certainty wavered. Richard's voice hardened. "You're bluffing." "I'm not," he said. He could see the tension coil in Vanessa's shoulders. Even she recognized it now. The balance had shifted. A pause settled over the room. The city outside moved, oblivious. The hum of air conditioning was louder than usual. "Do you understand what this means?" Richard asked, sharp, a note of desperation creeping in. "Non-compete, confidentiality, the board," he raised a hand. "I understand perfectly. And because of your overreach, many of these clauses would be unenforceable if challenged. I have counsel on standby, and my legal position is sound." Vanessa's mouth opened, then closed. She hadn't expected this. None of them had. "You're playing a dangerous game," Richard said, voice low but tense. "You think walking in here armed with paperwork changes anything?" "I think it clarifies who has leverage," he replied smoothly. "Which I believe is me." Richard glanced at the lawyers. Their faces were unreadable, but their body language shifted subtly, leaning forward, pen tapping against paper. They understood. Enforcement could trigger a costly, public, and clearly winnable legal dispute. Vanessa's voice broke the tension with cold precision. "So what do you want?" He lifted the severance paperwork, already neatly arranged in a folder. "I will sign what is necessary. I will collect what is due. And I will end the marriage cleanly." Her eyes widened slightly. Cleanly. No drama. No emotional leverage. Just finality. His gaze met hers. It's been procedural for a long time. Now it becomes factual. Richard slammed a hand lightly on the desk. You think walking away fixes anything? It fixes everything, he said, unflinching. I walked in here only to formalize what already exists. My freedom, my authority elsewhere, and the reality that I am done being a pawn. He reached into the folder and laid the documents before the lawyers. Please prepare the papers for signature. One of them nodded, moving with efficient precision, handing him a pen and placing each form carefully on the desk. Termination, NDA, non-compete, divorce acknowledgement, each lined up like markers in a chess game. Richard's jaw clenched. Do you realize how much control you're giving up? He looked directly at Richard. Control is an illusion you mistook for ownership. I'm trading yours for mine. Vanessa's face tightened. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. No words could shift the moment. The atmosphere had been rearranged. The power once monopolized by the family was now divisible and unmistakably outside their grasp. He signed with deliberate calm, one document at a time, watching the reactions carefully. The pen scratched softly, the only sound in the tense room. With each signature, a measure of history was acknowledged and ended. Finally, he leaned back slightly, breathing evenly, allowing the room to absorb the weight of finality. He didn't gloat. That wasn't the point. Precision was sufficient. You have your records, he said. You have the documents. You know the timelines. There is nothing else to contest. Richard's fingers drummed on the desk, slow and hard. You'll regret leaving. No, he said, voice steady. I'll regret nothing. And you'll learn what happens when control is wielded carelessly. The lawyers gathered the signed papers, checking them methodically. Vanessa folded her arms, silent now, her expression unreadable but rigid. Richard exhaled sharply, leaning back in the chair as if deflating under invisible weight. The hubris that had dominated every interaction for 6 years now seemed fragile, delicate, exposed. He collected the severance folder, sliding it into his briefcase. Not triumphantly, not vindicatively, simply practically, every move measured, deliberate. The balance of power had been recalibrated. Vanessa finally spoke, low, clipped. You'll be gone. Yes, he replied, and I'll stay gone. The room lingered in silence, thick with everything unsaid. The past 6 years of manipulation, control, loyalty, and resentment coiled in the air, palpable but inert. He had reduced it all to words, signatures, and evidence. He adjusted his jacket, picked up his suitcase, and paused just before the door. Goodbye, he said. Richard didn't respond immediately. Vanessa opened her mouth, closed it. The lawyers merely watched. The weight of the statement, simple, final, hung in the air. He stepped into the hallway. No handshakes, no arguments, no last-minute attempts to pull him back. He walked past the polished floors, past familiar portraits, past glass walls that had once felt like a cage. Every step echoed, control regained. The elevator doors closed behind him, muffling the tense silence left in his wake. The lobby was empty now, except for a passing receptionist, her eyes wide as she caught the trace of history departing. Outside, the cold air hit his face, crisp and unyielding. He rolled his shoulders, steady, and began walking down the driveway. Behind him, Hartwell headquarters remained intact, but diminished. The empire of influence, intimidation, and familial authority still stood, but its most dangerous pawn had removed himself from the board entirely. And for the first time in years, he felt complete clarity. He had signed, collected the severance, ended the marriage, walked away, clean, controlled, final. Chapter 10, A Different Kind of Power. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Apex's manufacturing division headquarters, casting long beams across polished floors and organized workstations. He paused at the threshold, letting the space register, quiet hum of computers, faint whir of printers, the occasional soft murmur of conversation. It was orderly without rigidity, alive without chaos. He felt a subtle, unfamiliar weight lift from his shoulders. For 6 years at Hartwell, mornings had begun with tension, emails screaming deadlines, bosses masking panic with authority. Here, there was none of that. Authority existed, yes, but it was functional, not performative. Respect wasn't demanded. It was inherent, earned, and reciprocated. Morning, a voice called from across the open office. A young analyst looked up, uncertainty written across his face. "You're the new CFO?" "Yes," he said, voice calm. "And I'd like to start by understanding what's actually happening with our pricing models. Not what someone wants me to see, but what the numbers are." The analyst blinked, then nodded, pulling up spreadsheets. The work began immediately. No ceremony, no posturing. For the first time, he felt the full weight of decision-making, coupled with the unusual luxury of transparency. He moved through the division, stopping at each station, asking questions with precision, listening with intent. Engineers, accountants, and sales managers responded in kind. They were not fearful. They were curious, willing to be candid. One of the pricing models caught his eye, a projection of profit margins for a multi-regional contract. Red flags appeared instantly. Aggressive assumptions, unrealistic sales targets, margin compression masked by hopeful forecasts. He traced the formulas carefully, marking notes for correction. Later, in a small meeting room, he gathered the leadership team. "Here's the reality," he said, placing a printed chart on the table. "We've been overstating potential margins in the Northeast region. If we don't adjust pricing and tighten accountability, we risk losing credibility with our largest clients." The CFO, who had been in the role, temporarily nodded. "We were hoping the numbers would balance by year-end." Expected volume growth. "Expected growth is not a strategy," he interrupted gently. "It's hope. We need facts. We need mechanisms. We need accountability." Murmurs of agreement followed. They leaned in, discussing possible adjustments. For the first time in years, he felt no need to argue for authority. He simply presented reality, and it was acknowledged. By midday, the first round of adjustments had been implemented. Internal emails circulated with clear directives. Staffers were relieved, not resentful. There was a distinct sense of collaboration rather than compliance. Later, while reviewing another contract, his phone vibrated. A single message appeared. A white envelope emoji and the initials RH. He frowned, momentarily tense. Hartwell, he realized, was attempting a reach. He opened the message. "Just remember where you came from. No threats. No specifics. Just a ghost." He smiled faintly. The effort was almost quaint. Hartwell could intimidate in boardrooms, manipulate family, and call vacations tyrannically, but none of that mattered here. He had authority. He had safety. He had transparency and respect. He tapped a reply in his mind. No actual message sent. No engagement required. It was recognition of the shadow without acknowledgement, an understanding that fear no longer dictated his actions. The day continued with a series of meetings. Production schedules, vendor negotiations, and team check-ins. At each step, he noted inefficiencies that had gone unchallenged for years. Simple process improvements that saved hours. Minor pricing errors that compounded into significant losses. He addressed them methodically, inviting feedback. The difference was stark. Solutions were welcomed, not resisted. By late afternoon, a junior manager approached cautiously. "Sir," the team, well, they're impressed. "No one's ever challenged us like this without shouting or threatening." He smiled softly. Respect doesn't require fear. It requires clarity, honesty, and consistency. That's what we'll practice here. Later, as the office quieted, he sat at his desk, reviewing financials for the next quarter. The view outside framed a city alive but orderly, the hum of commerce uninterrupted by panic or posturing. He allowed himself a moment of reflection. For 6 years, Hartwell had defined his reality. Exhaustion, fear, manipulation, control. It had been a cycle so complete he barely recognized life without it. And now, here, authority was not a weapon but a tool. Loyalty was not coerced but earned. Decisions had weight but not threat. The phone buzzed again, this time a standard notification. Not Hartwell. Internal Apex correspondence, reminders of meetings and approvals. Mundane, controlled, safe. He leaned back, fingers interlaced, breathing steady. The relief was quiet, almost imperceptible, but profound. For the first time, success wasn't revenge. It wasn't triumph over those who had wronged him. It was dignity reclaimed, power exercised without fear, without compromise, a life lived on his terms. A knock on the office door interrupted the quiet. The operations director peeked in. "Sir, do you have a minute to review next week's client pitch?" "Of course," he said. "Let's walk through the numbers together." The door closed softly behind her. He stood and followed, his stride confident but unhurried. There was no rush to prove anything. The work itself carried authority. As they went through the projections, he encouraged questions, listened attentively, and adjusted recommendations transparently. The team's trust was visible in their posture, their willingness to speak candidly. The room felt alive with collaboration. At the end of the day, he lingered near the window, watching the city lights reflected in the glass. A brief thought flitted through his mind. Hartwell, the memories of control, manipulation, and betrayal. But it was fleeting, easily displaced by the present reality. No calls, no threats, no ultimatums. Just a functioning organization where his decisions mattered, where loyalty was rewarded through respect and fairness rather than fear. He returned to his desk, reviewing emails one last time. Clear lines of communication, documented procedures, and accountable managers made him smile. 6 years of watching the numbers, of untangling chaos, of silently correcting what others ignored, had prepared him not for revenge, but for leadership grounded in integrity. A final glance at the inbox revealed no new messages from Hartwell, only internal updates, meeting reminders, and financial alerts. The hum of controlled efficiency. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of past burdens lifted, his shoulders straight. Stability had replaced fear. Competence replaced chaos. Respect replaced intimidation. And as the city outside dimmed into twilight, he realized the truth. Victory was not in retaliation, not in exposing failures or humiliating the past. Victory was quiet, methodical, and complete. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the quiet settle over him. This was the life he had fought for, not stolen, not demanded, but reclaimed. A flicker of light on the desk drew his attention. A small, ordinary envelope. He opened it, expecting perhaps another cryptic threat. Inside was nothing more than a note. "We know what you're capable of." He smiled, carefully placing the note aside. It didn't frighten him. It acknowledged what he already knew, what they had failed to control. Hartwell's shadow existed only as a memory now, flickering faintly, impotent. He returned to his work with calm, deliberate focus. Every decision, every correction, every adjustment reaffirmed his autonomy, his authority, and his quiet, steady power. No revenge, no theatrics, only clarity, dignity, and the satisfaction of finally living a life on his own terms. And for the first time in years, he felt complete, unshaken, and truly free.